The battlefield doesn't leave you. Not when you've seen what Nurse Mara Hendricks saw that night, a man with 3 bullets still buried in his body, a classified tattoo burned into the skin of his forearm, and a message scratched in dried blood across his own palm that read, "Don't let them take me back." Every doctor in that building called him a threat. Every security officer called him unstable. The hospital director wanted him restrained before they'd even run his blood type. But Mara Hendricks had spent 4 years pulling soldiers out of rubble in places that didn't appear on any map. She knew the difference between a man who wanted to kill and a man who was still fighting a war that nobody else could see. What she didn't know yet was that recognizing him would cost her everything she'd built in this quiet Montana life she'd been trying to hold together. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because this channel tells the stories nobody else will touch. Every single week, something that will keep you up at night. Hit the like button if you want more, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. A motorist heading north on Route 9 outside Calvert Falls, Montana, had spotted a man lying face down in the gravel shoulder, a stretch of high desert highway where the nearest gas station was 19 miles east, and the wind off the mountains came in cold enough to split skin. By the time the paramedics reached him, he had crawled 40 feet from his original position, dragging himself across pale, hard-packed dirt and leaving a dark smear behind him that the first responders initially mistook for an oil spill in the low beam of their headlights. He had 3 gunshot wounds, one through the left shoulder, one through the upper right side, which had deflected off a rib and done something to his interior that the field assessment couldn't fully characterize. One clean through and through in the lateral thigh that had nicked the muscle but missed the femoral by a margin that should not have been survivable given everything else. He was still conscious when the first EMT reached him. He grabbed her by the wrist. He said clearly, without confusion or slurring, "Sector's still hot. Don't break cover." Then he was out. They brought him into Calvert Regional Trauma Center at 12:19 a.m. No identification, no phone, no wallet. Nothing in his pockets except a folded piece of paper soaked so completely through with blood that the writing on it had gone to rust-colored shadow, unreadable, gone. He had no dog tags. His clothing had been stripped of every label. Not worn away, deliberately removed, cut clean at the seams. The only mark on his body that meant anything was the tattoo on the inside of his left forearm, a symbol that the intake nurse logged as decorative marking, geometric, approximately 3 inches, because she was 23 years old and had been working overnight shifts for 6 weeks and had never been anywhere that would have taught her what she was looking at. She didn't know it was classified. She didn't know it belonged to a special operations unit whose existence had never been formally acknowledged by anyone in any government building, anywhere, and whose personnel record sat behind a clearance wall so high that even confirming the unit existed required authorization most senior officers never received. She logged it as decorative. She moved on. She had 4 other intakes that night. Mara Hendricks wasn't supposed to be on shift. She was 34, originally from a small town in eastern Oregon, trauma certified, 8 months into her position at Calvert Regional after separating from the Army as a staff sergeant and qualified combat medic. 4 deployments. A service record that was clean on the surface and partially redacted underneath. She had taken the position in Calvert Falls specifically because it was quiet, a small regional center, mostly accident cases, the occasional agricultural injury, not the kind of place where the past could find her easily. She'd covered a colleague's shift because the woman had a family emergency and there was nobody else available, which meant she was running on 5 hours of sleep and her 3rd cup of terrible break room coffee when the paramedics came through the bay doors, and she was already gloved and moving before the gurney cleared the entrance because that was how her body worked in this building, automatically, ahead of the thinking. She started the primary assessment the way she always did. She was efficient, she wasn't sentimental about it, and then she stopped. Not because of the wounds. Trauma nurses don't stop for wounds. She had field-packed injuries worse than these lying flat in a drainage ditch while incoming came in close enough to feel the pressure of it in her teeth. What stopped her was the way he was moving. He was unconscious, his BP was dropping and his color was bad, and the pain should have had him fully under, but his head was shifting. Subtly, just a few degrees at a time, just enough to track. When the overhead fluorescence hit the glass panel across the bay, his head moved away from it. When one of the paramedics crossed from his left side to his right arm tensed, fingers curling toward nothing, the body trying to complete a motion the conscious mind couldn't direct. He was clearing the room. He was running threat assessment from inside an unconscious state, and he was doing it correctly, the way people did it when it had been drilled so deep that the nervous system just kept executing the protocol regardless of what the rest of them was doing. Mara had seen this before. She knew what it was. She knew specifically what kind of training produced it. She said nothing. She did the job. She ran the panel, ordered the imaging, pulled lines, and prepped the cart, and she worked with the same flat efficiency she always used, and she kept watching him the entire time. His hands were calloused in specific patterns. The webbing between thumb and forefinger, the heel of the palm, the knuckles marked not by fighting, but by rope work, by load-bearing equipment, by edges that left particular kinds of scars. His shoulder and upper back musculature had the specific architecture that came from years of weighted fieldwork, not weight rooms. There was a density to it that wasn't aesthetic. It was structural. Built for sustained performance over time in conditions that didn't care about comfort. Whoever he was, he had not been a soldier in the administrative sense. He had been somewhere that used him hard and expected him to keep going. Dr. Nathan Rice arrived and took over the primary. He was the chief of emergency medicine, compact, controlled, very good at his job, and the kind of physician who ran a tight floor and did not find deviation from his protocols charming under any circumstances. He assessed, he directed, he ordered the CT for the abdominal concern and called the surgical attending. He noted the patient's earlier behavior with the paramedic and told security to post at the bay door. 2 officers arrived and planted themselves with the body language of people who had been told the situation was dangerous. They stood too close. They faced the wrong direction. They were watching the patient like they were waiting for something, and Mara looked at their posture and thought quietly that this was the exact configuration most likely to trigger a defensive response from someone who was running the kind of unconscious threat loop she was watching unfold on this gurney. She almost said something. She didn't, not yet. She picked her moments. The surgical attending, Dr. Cassidy Pruitt, arrived 20 minutes later in the manner of surgical attendings called in at 1 in the morning, professionally composed on top, visibly unhappy underneath. She reviewed the imaging. She and Rice conferred quietly. They agreed on a stabilize and monitor plan with surgical prep on standby pending the abdominal read. Mara charted. She turned over 2 other patients. She checked on a post-op in room 7. She kept coming back. At 1:07 a.m., the patient came up. Not gradually. Not the slow surfacing of someone fighting through sedation. He came up the way soldiers came up when something woke them in the field. All at once. Every system. No intermediate stage between under and fully operational. His eyes were open and tracking before any of them had registered the change in his vitals. And by the time the monitor began alarming, he was sitting upright with his IV ripped free and a surgical clamp he'd taken from the instrument tray in his right hand, and not one person in that bay had seen him move to get it. He was standing on the gurney. He was scanning. Door first, entry and exit, threat assessment, exactly right. Then windows. Then each person in sequence, Rice, Pruitt, both security officers, the radiology tech still in the corner with the portable unit. He went through all of them, and then he reached Mara, and he stopped. He didn't lower the clamp, but he stopped moving. Perimeter soft, he said. Ragged voice, pain underneath it, but the cadence was deliberate and precise. Where's my team? Sir, you need to... Rice stepped toward him. The patient shifted his weight, dropped his stance lower, repositioned the clamp. Not aggressive. Mara could read the difference. He wasn't preparing to attack. He was establishing a perimeter. He was keeping space between himself and unknown contacts until he could establish who was safe. One of the security officers reached for his radio. Do not call that in, Mara said. Everyone looked at her. Hendricks. Rice said her name the way people said it when they meant stop. If you bring more people into this room right now, someone is going to get hurt. He's not attacking us. He doesn't know where he is. She kept her voice even. She was watching the patient. Give me 90 seconds. You have no authority to... 90 seconds, Dr. Rice. She didn't wait. She moved toward the patient, directly. No angles, no flanking approach, hands visible, pace steady, nothing that would read as tactical. She stopped outside his arm's reach and she looked at him without making it a contest. "You are not in the field," she said. "You are in a hospital, Calvert Falls, Montana. You came off Route 9. A motorist called it in. You've been here a little over an hour." His eyes were still moving too fast. The scan hadn't stopped. "Route 9, she said again. "You were on the highway. That's why you're alive. Someone drove past and called it in." The clamp dropped, maybe 2 inches. "Team," he said. "My team. I don't have information about your team. I can't give you what I don't have." She kept her voice level, factual, no softness in it. Softness would read as manipulation to someone in this state. "What I can tell you is that you're bleeding internally, and if you don't let us help you, you're not going to make it through the next 2 hours. That's not a threat. That's just what's happening in your body right now." The room was holding its breath. He looked at her. Not the scanning look. This was different. This was the focused assessment of someone who had learned that most things in the world were not what they appeared to be, and who had survived by being very precise about which things were the exceptions. "What's your call sign?" he said. The floor dropped out. She had a call sign. She'd had one for 4 years, attached to a deployment she'd never spoken about in this city, this job, this version of her life. It wasn't in any record that a civilian background check would surface. It wasn't something you found by looking for it. It lived in a sealed context, behind clearances and redactions, and a set of operational files that she'd been told, in explicit terms, were never to be referenced outside of specific secured environments. She hadn't said it aloud in over 2 years. She said it now, quietly. Just the 2 words. The patient closed his eyes. He sat down on the gurney. He put the clamp on the mattress beside him. He said, "Okay." Rice was furious. He didn't raise his voice. He was too controlled for that. But she could read it in every interaction for the next 4 hours. She had overstepped. She had approached a potentially dangerous patient without authorization, used some kind of personal code she hadn't explained to the team, and done it in a way that bypassed his clinical authority. He pulled her from the primary bay and assigned her to the general floor, which was well within his right to do, and she went without argument because she understood the optics, and because she needed to be somewhere she could think. She charted, she checked patients, she did the work, and she turned over what she knew, quietly, underneath everything else. The tattoo on his forearm was not decorative. She had seen that symbol exactly twice in her life. Once in a classified briefing during her 3rd deployment, displayed on a single slide that had been shown for approximately 45 seconds before the presentation moved on. Once on the arm of a man she'd worked alongside for 6 weeks, a taciturn, highly capable operator named Hollister, who had been part of an attached unit during an operation in a region she couldn't name in any document and wouldn't name now. Hollister had been listed as killed on the final night of that operation. That was what the paperwork said. What little paperwork existed. The symbol was unit-specific. It wasn't something you researched. You either knew it because you had been inside that particular context, or you didn't know it existed. The fact that this man had it on his forearm meant one thing, and one thing only. He had been part of the same world, the same sealed operational structure, the same buried history that she had spent 2 years trying to set down and mostly failing at. Who he was specifically, and why he was here bleeding in Montana with no identification and a message on his hand that she didn't know yet. At 4:30 a.m., the notification came through the patient tracking system. 2 individuals at the front desk were asking about an unidentified male trauma intake. No credentials offered, no law enforcement identification. The night coordinator had flagged it to the charge nurse who had flagged it to Mara because technically John Doe was her intake, and nobody was sure what the protocol was for this situation. She pulled the lobby camera feed on the nearest workstation. 2 men. Dark civilian clothing, the deliberate kind, the kind chosen for not being remembered. The shorter one was speaking to the coordinator with a specific kind of calm that she recognized, the calm of someone who had never in their professional life needed to raise their voice to get a result. The taller one stood slightly back and slightly to the side, facing the lobby at an angle that gave him sightlines on both exits. She knew that posture. She had stood in it herself. She closed the feed. She walked to the supply corridor, took a moment alone, and used exactly 8 seconds to think it through. Someone had tracked a wounded man through an emergency call chain. Not a public emergency response, because the location and the lack of identification should have produced nothing searchable, and arrived at this hospital 4 hours after intake without credentials and without a cover story. They hadn't said they were family. They hadn't said they were federal. They hadn't said anything except that they were looking. They were not here to help him. She went back to the floor. She pulled his chart. She made a decision that she knew clearly and without illusion could end her career at this hospital. She removed his bed assignment from the public-facing board and relabeled his room identifier in the tracking system with a notation that moved him, on paper, to a different ward entirely. It was not protocol. It was not something she could easily explain. She did it, and then she went to his room. He was awake. The monitor showed a long, flat run of controlled vital signs that looked, to anyone reading it casually, like sleep. But she had worked with enough operators to recognize the signature of someone producing stillness deliberately. He was looking at the ceiling when she pushed the door open, and his eyes moved to her immediately. "They're here," she said. She kept her voice low. "Two of them. Front lobby. No credentials. They haven't identified themselves as law enforcement." He held her look. "I moved your location in the system," she said. "It buys time, not much." "You shouldn't have done that." "Probably not. It's going to come apart when they push the desk coordinator." "I know, but right now you have time you didn't have 10 minutes ago, so..." She pulled a chair over and sat down. "The tattoo on your arm. I know what it is. I've seen it twice. That's the only answer you're getting about how." Something shifted in his face, a recalibration. He was reassessing her, updating his read. "The 14th evac," he said. "Southern corridor. The operation that went wrong at the end." Her chest tightened. "You were there," she said. "After. I was part of a team sent to recover assets from the failed extraction." He breathed through something. The pain was working on him. She could see it in the way he held his side. There was documentation from that operation. Records that were supposed to be destroyed. They weren't destroyed. Someone kept them. "You. Not just me. But I'm the only one left who knows where the physical cache is." He paused. His eyes went to the door, then back to her. "The men downstairs aren't here for interrogation. If they were going to interrogate me, they would have identified themselves to the desk and requested access through the hospital administrator. They didn't do that." She understood what he was saying. She sat with it for a moment. "Who sent them?" she said. "The same person who's been cleaning up the evidence from that operation for the last 3 years. Senior officer. The kind of rank that makes people stop asking questions." He stopped. "The operation your unit was pulled into, the one that ended wrong. That wasn't friendly fire and it wasn't mission failure. It was a decision. Someone ordered it and then ordered the record altered." She was very still. "And the documentation proves that," she said. "The documentation proves everything. Names, dates, the actual operational orders versus what was filed afterward." He watched her face. "You left the Army after it. Most of your unit did, one way or another. Some of them didn't get the option of leaving." She knew what he meant by that. She had suspected it for 2 years. She had told herself it was the kind of suspicion that came from grief and exhaustion, the kind of shape your mind made out of coincidence when you were trying to make sense of something that felt senseless. She had tried very hard to let it be coincidence. "Where is it?" she said. "The documentation." He opened his mouth. The IV pump alarm went off. Not a cardiac alert. The line had infiltrated again, fluid backing into the tissue, the pump screaming its error tone into the quiet of the room, and she was already moving because that was the job and her hands didn't wait for her brain to catch up. She got the line pulled back, she repositioned the catheter. She silenced the pump and checked the site, and the whole thing took maybe 90 seconds. She turned back to him. The door was open. She had closed it. She had pulled it to when she came in and heard the latch engage, that specific small mechanical sound of the pneumatic seal fitting into the frame. She was certain of it the way you were certain of things you did automatically, without thinking, because you'd done them 1,000 times. It was open now, maybe 8 inches, enough for someone to have looked in. She crossed to the door in 4 steps and looked into the corridor. Empty. Both directions. The hallway stretched under the flat overnight lighting, clean and still. The nursing station 30 feet down with the overnight tech's head bent over a screen. She looked up. The camera above the nursing station, the one that covered this entire wing of the floor, had its indicator light off. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and felt her pulse doing something it hadn't done in 2 years. felt the specific quality of alertness that she thought she'd managed to leave behind, that she thought she'd traded in for overnight shifts and bad coffee and a quiet apartment and a life that was manageable. Someone had cut the camera manually, sometime in the last few minutes, and someone had been in this corridor while she was dealing with the IV line, close enough to that open door to see inside. She turned back to the room. He was already sitting up. His jaw was set hard against the pain of moving, but his eyes were fully operational, clear and fast, and reading the same information she was. "They found the room," she said. "How long before someone checks on the camera?" he said. "Overnight maintenance doesn't run until 6. That's—" She checked the clock on the wall. "Hour and 20 minutes. Then we have less than that." He was already looking at the room's layout, the window, the door, the utility panel in the corner that she'd never had cause to open in 8 months of working this floor. "There's a service corridor system in this building. Older hospitals have them, running beneath the main floor connections. I know the building." "How well?" "Well enough." She looked at him, at the pallor of his face, the careful way he was breathing, the IV site on his arm that was going to be a problem the moment he tried to move with any urgency. "You're in no condition to—" "I know what condition I'm in," he said, and his voice wasn't hard about it, just factual. "I also know that the 2 men downstairs are going to find this room in the next 40 minutes, regardless of what you changed in the system, because that's not the only way to locate a patient in a building this size. And when they do, the conversation isn't going to be one I can afford to have." She looked at him. She thought about the camera with its light out. She thought about the open door. She thought about a deployment 3 years ago that she'd tried for 2 years to stop dreaming about, and a man named Hollister whose death she'd been told was confirmed, and a classified symbol that was not supposed to exist on anyone's arm in a trauma bay in rural Montana. She thought about the message on his hand, the one written in his own blood. "Don't let them take me back." "I need to get you something for the pain," she said, "and I need 2 minutes." "You have 90 seconds, he said. She almost argued. She didn't. She grabbed what she needed from the supply cart outside his door, worked fast, did what she could for the immediate situation, and when she came back in, he was already at the edge of the bed with his feet on the floor and a look on his face that told her he had already decided how this was going to go and was simply waiting for her to reach the same conclusion. She looked at the door. She looked at him. "The service access is at the end of the east corridor," she said. "There's a panel that looks like HVAC. It's not locked from this side." He nodded once. She went to the window, checked the angle to the parking lot below, clear, and then turned off the room light before she opened the door, because the hallway was brighter and she didn't want a silhouette. The corridor was empty. For now. She went through the door first and he came behind her, and somewhere below them in the lobby, 2 men with no credentials and no good reason to be here were working their way toward a room that, in about 45 minutes, was going to be empty. And she was going to have a very difficult conversation with Dr. Nathan Rice in the morning, assuming she made it to morning. The east corridor was 32 feet of exposed hallway before the HVAC panel, and there was no good way to cover it. Mara went first. She kept her pace even, not hurrying, because hurrying in a hospital corridor at 5 in the morning read wrong to anyone watching, and there were still staff at the nursing station at the far end. And she moved with the specific quality of someone who belonged exactly where she was, which was a skill she had not lost in 8 months of civilian life. She heard him behind her. His footsteps were controlled, quieter than they had any right to be for a man with a through and through in his thigh and a rib that had taken a bullet's deflection. But she could hear the irregularity in his gait, the half-second catch on the left side where the shoulder wound was pulling. He was managing it. She didn't look back. The panel was where she'd said it was. A gray metal rectangle set flush into the wall beside a linen storage room, marked with a faded yellow sticker that said, "Maintenance Access" in letters that had been peeling for at least 3 years. She'd noticed it months ago during an overnight when she'd had nothing to do but walk the floor, and she'd filed it the way she filed everything about spaces she occupied, automatically, without deciding to, as a habit that had started in places where knowing your exits was the difference between going home and not going home. She pressed the release. The panel swung inward on a pivot hinge, no lock, just a friction catch, opening onto a concrete shaft with a metal ladder bolted to the far wall and a drop of about 4 feet to a lower passage. The air coming up from it was cold and smelled of dust and old machinery, and something faintly chemical that she couldn't immediately identify. She went in first, dropped to the lower passage, felt the impact in her knees, looked up. He came through the opening, and she could see, in the flat light from the corridor above, exactly what it cost him. He got one hand on the ladder, got his weight distributed, and came down with the injured shoulder doing something that made the muscle in his jaw jump hard. He didn't make a sound. He hit the passage floor and stood still for a moment, breathing through his nose, and she let him have the moment without comment because there was nothing useful to say about it. She reached up and pulled the panel to from the inside. The darkness was almost complete. She had her phone. She turned the flashlight on low, not bright enough to throw light under door gaps if anyone was looking, and pointed it at the passage ahead. Concrete floor, concrete walls, pipes running the length of the ceiling in clusters. The passage ran in two directions. Left would take them toward the older west wing of the building, which had been partially decommissioned 3 years ago and was now used primarily for storage. Right would take them toward the utility substation at the building's foundation, and from there to the external access point she knew existed because she'd seen it noted on the fire evacuation map posted in the break room. "Right," she said quietly. He didn't argue. They moved. She kept the pace manageable, not because she couldn't move faster, but because pushing him faster than his body could sustain would produce a collapse somewhere in this passage, and a collapsed man in a 4-foot-wide concrete tunnel in the foundation of a hospital was a problem she didn't have a solution for. He kept up. She could hear the effort it cost him in the quality of his breathing, the slight hitch on the inhale that told her the rib situation was more painful than he was acknowledging, but he kept moving, and he kept quiet, and she found herself thinking that whoever had trained this man had trained him very thoroughly to endure things and not broadcast them. After about 3 minutes, she said, very low, "The documentation. Where?" "Storage unit," he said. Behind her, same volume. "Commercial facility, 11 miles east of Calvert Falls on Route 9, Unit 114. Key is—" He paused, breathing through something. "Was in my left boot. They would have taken it with my other effects." She thought about the personal effects bag that would be sitting in the secure intake cabinet at the nursing station, which was now a nursing station she couldn't walk back to. "Is there another way in?" she said. "Combination override, 6 digits." He gave them to her once, slowly. She repeated them back in her head and locked them down the way she'd learned to lock down information when writing it wasn't an option. The evidence is in a military-grade case. Gray, hard shell, latches on both short ends. There are 3 folders inside and a drive. What's on the drive? Audio. Recorded command-level conversations authorizing the operational changes that were later reported as combat error. He paused again. Your unit's final mission. The decision to alter the extraction route. Who made it and why? She walked for a moment without speaking. She had been told, officially and in terms she was expected to accept, that the route change on that final night had been a field-level decision made under time pressure. She had been told it was a tragic outcome in an unpredictable operational environment. She had been told these things by people with more rank than her, in rooms she hadn't been given the option to leave until the conversation was over. And she had taken it because what was the alternative? You took what they told you. You processed it in whatever way let you keep functioning. You eventually left the army and moved to a quiet place and worked overnight shifts and tried very hard not to think about who hadn't come home. How long have you had it? She said. 3 years. And in 3 years you haven't been able to— I've been running for 3 years, he said, and his voice was flat about it, not looking for sympathy, just stating the operational reality. Every time I got close to a position where I could release it safely, they found me first. 3 different cities, 2 different countries. A pause. Montana was supposed to be a handoff point. Someone was supposed to meet me on Route 9. They didn't show. No. She thought about what that meant, whether the person hadn't shown because they'd been intercepted or because they'd been the source of the leak that put those 3 bullets in him in the first place. She thought about the 2 men in the lobby and whoever had cut the camera on the 4th floor, and the way that operation had moved too fast and with too much precision for people who were supposed to be responding to an unplanned hospital intake. Someone had known he was here before those men walked through the front door. She stopped walking, held up a hand. Ahead of them, somewhere in the concrete dark past the reach of her phone light, something had moved. A sound, brief, metallic, The kind of sound that a pipe made when pressure shifted through it, which happened constantly in old building infrastructure, except this one had a rhythm to it that wasn't quite mechanical. She turned off the light. They stood in complete dark and she counted seconds and listened. Nothing. After 15 seconds, she turned the light back on low and kept moving, but she filed it, and she didn't fully release the tension that had come up in her shoulders. The utility substation was at the end of the passage, a room about the size of a large closet, dense with electrical panels and junction boxes, and the kind of industrial infrastructure that nobody maintained more than they had to. The external access was a steel door in the far wall with a push bar and a sign that said, "Emergency exit, alarm will sound." She looked at the sign. She looked at the door. "It's going to be loud," she said. "Do you have a choice?" She didn't. She pushed the bar. The alarm was loud. It was the specific screaming pitch of a fire door alarm, designed to be unmissable, and it was going to bring building security to this exit point within 4 minutes, which was not a lot of time. The door opened onto a loading bay at the rear of the building. Concrete apron, 2 large dumpsters, a single light on a pole that turned the area the flat yellow of sodium vapor. Beyond the loading bay, the hospital's rear access road curved toward the main street, and beyond that, the dark open of the Montana night. She got him through the door, and they moved across the loading bay fast. I was limping more noticeably now. The cold had gotten into the thigh wound, or the adrenaline was wearing, or both. But he was moving, and she stayed close enough to take his weight, if she had to, without making it obvious she was doing it. They reached the access road. "My car is in the staff lot," she said. "East side of the building, 3 minutes. Security will be at the loading bay in 2. "I know." She looked at him. "Can you run?" He looked back at her. "Define run," he said. They ran. It wasn't clean. He was managing a gunshot thigh, and she was managing the fact that she'd been awake for nearly 24 hours and had just gone from a hospital floor to a service tunnel to an exterior loading bay without a transition plan. They made the staff lot in just under 3 minutes, and she had her keys out before they reached the car, a 4-year-old gray sedan that she had never once been grateful for until this moment, when its complete unremarkability felt like a tactical advantage. She got him into the passenger seat. She got in. She pulled out of the lot at a speed that was fast, but not the kind of fast that left marks. In her rearview mirror, as she turned onto the main road, she saw the loading bay doors open and a security officer step out with a flashlight sweeping the concrete. Too late. They were already past the edge of the light. She drove. 6 miles out of Calvert Falls on Route 9, she pulled off at a closed fuel station and sat in the dark with the engine running and thought through what she had and what she didn't have. What she had: a wounded operative with classified knowledge, no identification, and 3 gunshot wounds that had been partially treated and would become septic if they weren't properly managed within the next 18 to 24 hours. A phone with a compromised GPS. An address for a storage facility with documentation that, if it was what he said it was, represented the most significant thing she'd held in her hands in 4 years. What she didn't have: a plan, a contact, a safe location, or any way to communicate with anyone she trusted without using channels that might be watched. She turned off her phone, took out the SIM card, put both pieces in the glove box. "You have someone," he said from the passenger seat. It wasn't a question. I was watching her work through it. "Maybe," she said. "Someone I was in contact with after I separated. She's not active anymore either." She paused. "I don't know if I can reach her without a phone." "Does she have a fixed address?" Mara thought about it. She had a street address that was 2 years old, from a card that had arrived in her mailbox during her first winter in Calvert Falls. A brief note, nothing sensitive in it, just a way of saying, "I know where you are, and I'm still reachable." She'd memorized the return address because that was what she did with addresses. She'd never used it. "Yes," she said. "How far?" "If it's still current, 2 hours north." He nodded. He shifted in the seat and winced and tried not to show that he'd winced and partially succeeded. "Your wound is going to open if you keep moving like that," she said. "I know." "I'm serious. The packing isn't going to hold through a 2-hour drive if you keep—" "Mara." He said her name for the first time. She didn't know if he'd seen it on her badge or if he'd known it from before. "I know what my body is doing. I've been running wounded before. I'll manage." Managing isn't the same as fine. I'm not trying to be fine. I'm trying to make it 2 more hours. He paused. There's a difference. She put the car in gear and pulled back onto the highway. He told her his name 40 minutes into the drive. He said it the way people said things they'd stopped saying for a while, testing the weight of it. His name was Declan Marsh. He'd been a special operations sniper for 11 years before the mission that changed everything, and the unit designation on his arm was the only record of his actual assignment during the final 3 years of his service. Everything else, all the official paperwork, listed him as attached to a logistics support battalion in a part of the world where nothing interesting happened. How many people know you're not dead? She said. He thought about it. 4, maybe 5. One of them set me up on Route 9. You know which one? I have a strong idea. His voice was level about it, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. There's not much I can do about it until the documentation is out. And once it's out, then everything that happened gets reviewed, officially, by people who can't be controlled by the officer who ordered the cover-up. He paused. There will be an investigation. People will lose their positions. Some will face charges. And the people who didn't come home from the Southern Corridor operation. A silence. They'll be correctly listed, he said. What happened to them will be on the record, not what was filed. She drove for a while without speaking. She'd had 2 people from her unit on that operation. One of them had been her closest friend in 4 years of military service, a medic named Travers, who was funny in the dry, understated way of people who had seen too much to find obvious things amusing. Travers had been officially listed as a casualty resulting from navigational error during a night movement, which was a description so inadequate for what had actually happened that she'd spent a year being quietly furious every time she let herself think about it. She wasn't going to say any of that out loud. Not right now. But she drove a little faster. At the 90-minute mark, he said, "Pull over." She did. She pulled onto the shoulder and left the engine running and turned on the interior light and looked at him. And what she saw confirmed what she'd been monitoring in her peripheral vision for the last 30 minutes. It was pale in a way that was past exertion. The breathing was shallower. The wound at his side had soaked through the dressing she'd improvised from hospital supplies before they left, and she could see the dark spread of it through the material. "I need to repack it," she said. "I know." He didn't argue, which told her more than his vital signs did. She got the supply bag from the back seat. She'd taken what she could grab quickly: gauze, tape, antiseptic, a compression wrap, 2 units of saline from the floor cart, and she worked in the dome light of the car on a Montana highway shoulder at 6:30 in the morning with the kind of focus that came from having done this in conditions where the light was worse and the stakes were higher. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. That was the thing about her hands. They did not participate in panic. He stayed still while she worked. He made one sound, a short, controlled exhale, when she repacked the side wound, and that was it. "The rib is the problem," she said. "The deflection caused more bruising than I can assess without imaging. If there's any splenic involvement, there isn't, I'd know. You'd know some signs, not all of them. Mara. I'm telling you the risk profile so you can make an informed—" "I understand the risk profile." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking you to make this decision for me. I'm asking you to get me to that contact so I can transfer the documentation to someone who can move it. After that, you can take me to whatever hospital you want, and I'll sign whatever forms they need." She held his gaze for a moment. She taped the new dressing down. She checked the shoulder. She rechecked the thigh. 30 more minutes, she said. 30 more minutes, he agreed. She pulled back onto the highway. Oh. The address was a property set back from a county road north of a town called Shelby Creek, a farmhouse with a long gravel drive and a light on above the porch that might have been left on from the night before, or might have been left on as a standing signal. Mara didn't know which. She pulled off the county road and stopped before the turn onto the drive and sat looking at the property for a full 60 seconds. No vehicles she didn't expect. No movement at the windows. The light above the porch was steady, not flickering. She turned onto the drive. The woman who came to the door before Mara had even knocked was 41, lean, with gray already threaded through dark hair she kept short, and eyes that assessed the two people on her porch in a single pass that took approximately 1 second and landed on Declan's state immediately. "How long ago?" she said to Mara, not a greeting, just the necessary question. 6 hours for the primary wounds. He's been mobile for the last 2. The woman, her name was Vera Solano, and she had been an intelligence analyst and field officer before she hadn't been, stepped back and held the door open. Get him inside. They got him inside. Vera's house was the kind of space that told you something about the person who lived in it. Spare, but not barren, functional in the specific way of people who'd spent time in places where everything had to serve a purpose. She had a room off the kitchen that she'd clearly set up for exactly this kind of situation. A cot, a medical kit that was significantly better stocked than anything you'd find in a civilian first aid supply. Clean light. Vera looked at Mara while Declan lowered himself onto the cot. You've been out 8 months, Vera said. 9. And you brought him here. I brought him here, Mara said, because there wasn't anywhere else, and because what he's carrying involves the Southern Corridor operation. Something moved through Vera's expression. Controlled, but real. How much of it? Vera said. All of it, Declan said from the cot. The full record. Audio included. Vera stood still for a moment. She had the quality of stillness that came from training. Not passive, not relaxed, just contained. The storage unit, she said. Route 9, Unit 114. He gave her the override code. She repeated it back once and didn't write it down. I'll need 2 hours. They'll have people watching the facility, Mara said. Whoever came to the hospital will have made the connection by now. They'll have 1 person watching it, Vera said. Maybe 2. If they had more resources than that in this area, he'd be dead on Route 9 instead of on my cot. She was already moving toward a cabinet on the far wall. I know how to get in and out of a storage facility without being noticed. That's not the problem. What's the problem? Mara said. Vera opened the cabinet. It held, among other things, a secure communications unit that had no business being in a farmhouse in northern Montana, and a laptop whose case had modifications Mara recognized from procurement requests she'd filed during her 3rd deployment. The problem, Vera said, is that I made contact last week with a federal investigator who's been building a separate case on the same officer. He's been working it for 2 years and he's close, but he needs source documentation that he can legally introduce. What Declan has could give him that. She turned to look at them both, which means the moment I pull that case and make contact with him, the people trying to suppress it are going to know the documentation exists and where it's going. How fast can they move? Mara said. Fast. Vera looked at her steadily, which means the window between pulling the documentation and getting it into protected federal hands is very short, and there cannot be any errors in that window. Declan spoke from the cot. How short? If I retrieve it in the next 2 hours and make contact immediately, maybe 4 hours total. 4 hours where you and the documentation and anyone connected to either of you are completely exposed. She let that sit. Mara thought about the camera with its light cut. She thought about the 2 men in the lobby who hadn't shown credentials. She thought about the loading bay and the staff parking lot and the 30 miles of Montana highway they'd just covered in the dark. She thought about Travers and the navigational error that hadn't been one. Do it, she said. Vera nodded once. She was already opening the communications unit when the gravel outside shifted under the weight of a vehicle turning slowly, without headlights, onto the long drive from the county road. Vera heard it at the same moment Mara did. They looked at each other across the room. That's not a random turn, Mara said. No, Vera said. She closed the laptop. She looked at Declan. She looked at Mara. Her voice was completely flat when she said it. Someone followed you here. Mara was already moving before Vera finished the sentence. Not toward the door. That was the wrong instinct. The civilian instinct. The one that got people hurt. She moved toward the window beside the door, the narrow vertical pane that gave a sight line down the length of the drive without putting her silhouette in the frame. She kept to the wall, leaned just enough to see. The vehicle was a dark SUV, no plates visible from this angle, moving at the specific pace of something that was trying not to announce itself. No headlights. The driver knew the drive well enough to navigate it in the ambient dark of early morning, or had taken it slowly enough that the tree line on either side was doing the work. It had stopped about 60 yards out and was sitting with the engine idling, watching the house. One vehicle, Mara said. Stopped on the drive. Can't see plates. Vera was already at the cabinet again. She pulled 2 things out, a compact radio unit and a handgun that she checked by feel without looking at it, magazine, chamber, and then set on the counter beside the communications equipment. She didn't hand the gun to Mara. She didn't offer it. She just put it where it could be reached. "How many came to the hospital?" Vera said. "2 that I saw." "Same vehicle?" "I don't know. I didn't see how they arrived." Vera thought for a beat. "If they followed you from the hospital, they held back far enough that you didn't make them on Route 9. That's not standard surveillance. That's someone who knows the destination and doesn't need to stay close." The implication settled into the room. "They knew about you," Mara said. "Or they knew about this address." Vera's voice was even. "Which means the leak isn't just operational. Someone with access to old personnel files has been working this longer than the last 12 hours. From the cot, Declan said, "Rourke." Both women looked at him. His color was bad, worse than when they'd arrived, and he was holding himself very still in the way of people managing pain through stillness, but his eyes were clear and focused. "The investigator you mentioned, federal. His name wouldn't be Rourke." Vera went quiet for a moment. That was one beat too long. "How do you know that name?" she said. "Because Rourke contacted me 8 months ago through a cutout. Secure channel. He said he was building a case and needed source documentation and that he had a protected pipeline to get it into evidentiary custody." Declan paused, breathed carefully. "I told him I needed more time to verify the channel before I committed to a handoff. He went quiet for 3 months. Then 2 weeks ago, he reached back out with a specific location and time. Route 9, last night." Vera was very still. "The handoff that didn't happen," Mara said. "The handoff where I took 3 bullets instead of meeting a contact," Declan said. "Yes." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Outside, the SUV hadn't moved. Still idling, still dark. "Rourke is either compromised, or he was never what he said he was," Vera said. "Or he's dead," Mara said. "And whoever intercepted his channel set up the Route 9 meeting themselves." Either way, Vera picked up the handgun, not pointing it anywhere, just holding it. "The person or people in that vehicle are not here to help us, and they knew to come here, which means we have a problem that is bigger than one SUV on a driveway." She looked at Mara. "The documentation. Without it, everything Declan knows is testimony from a man who officially doesn't exist, with wounds that could be explained 6 different ways. With it, there's an actual case," Mara said. "With it, there's an actual case that cannot be walked back." Vera looked at the communications unit on the counter. "I need to reach someone outside the channel Rourke was using, someone who doesn't connect back to any of this." She paused. "That's going to take time I'm not sure we have." The SUV's engine cut off. All 3 of them heard it. The specific silence of an engine stopping was different from other silences. And in a house where everyone in the room had spent time in environments where that distinction mattered, it landed immediately. "They're done watching," Mara said. Vera moved to the window. One look. 2 individuals. Coming on foot up the drive. "They're not running." She stepped back. "They don't think we know they're here." "Which means they think they have time," Mara said. "They're not expecting resistance." "Let's not correct that assumption before we have to." Vera was already moving through the kitchen toward the rear of the house, and her movements had the quality of someone executing a plan she'd mentally rehearsed enough times that the steps were automatic. She pulled the kitchen door open. It led to a small enclosed porch, and beyond that a yard backing onto a tree line, and turned back to Mara. "I need you to get him out the back. Through the trees there's a dry creek bed that runs north for about half a mile. Follow it to the county road. My truck is parked at the property junction. Gray, unlocked, key under the driver's side wheel." "Well." She looked at Declan. "Can you walk?" "I've been walking," he said. "I need a better answer than that." "Yes," he said. "I can walk." "Then go." She looked at Mara. "The storage unit. Route 9, 11 miles east. I'll meet you there." "You're staying," Mara said. It wasn't a question. "Someone has to make sure they don't follow you." Vera's voice was matter-of-fact about it, in the way of someone who had assessed the options and arrived at the only one that made operational sense. "I'm not going to engage them unless I have to. I just need to slow them down." Mara looked at her for a moment. There was a lot she could have said. She didn't say any of it. "Don't do anything stupid," she said. "I never do anything stupid," Vera said. I do things that look stupid until they work. She handed Mara the keys to the truck from a hook beside the kitchen door, and then she was gone back toward the front of the house, and Mara turned to Declan and said, "Up, now." He got up. It took a second longer than it would have 12 hours ago, and she could see the assessment he was running on himself, cataloging what he had left, what was deteriorating, what he could push, and what he couldn't. He arrived at some internal calculation and nodded, and she got his arm over her shoulder and they went through the kitchen and out the back porch door into the cold pre-dawn air of northern Montana. The yard was maybe 30 feet of open ground between the house and the tree line. Open ground was open ground. She didn't like it. She didn't have a choice about it. She moved fast and she moved low, and she felt him matching her pace, limping but keeping up, his breathing controlled in that deliberate way that told her he was managing pain through technique rather than medication, and had been doing it for a while. They hit the trees. The creek bed was where Vera had said it would be, a shallow depression in the forest floor, dry at this time of year, with smooth rocks underfoot that were uneven enough to be a problem for someone who wasn't watching every step. Mara watched every step. She watched his and hers simultaneously, which was something that required a specific kind of split attention that she hadn't used in 8 months and accessed now without thinking about it. Behind them, from the direction of the house, she heard nothing for 60 seconds, and then heard a door open and close. She didn't know what that meant. She kept moving. The creek bed ran north through the trees for what felt longer than half a mile in the dark and the cold, with the sky beginning to go gray-blue at the edges ahead of a sunrise that was still 40 minutes out. At one point, Declan stumbled. His left foot caught a rock wrong, and he went down to one knee, and she had her hands on his arm before he'd finished going down, and he got back up without speaking and kept walking. His shoulder was bleeding again. She could see the dark patch spreading through the material of the spare shirt Vera had given him, but she didn't stop to address it because stopping to address it in a forest in the dark with people somewhere behind them was a worse outcome than bleeding through a shirt. The county road appeared through the thinning trees. She saw the truck, gray, older model, sitting at the property junction exactly where Vera had said it would be. She got him to it, found the key, got the engine started. She pulled onto the county road heading south. The storage facility was called Ridgeline Self-Storage, and it sat back from Route 9 behind a chain-link fence with keypad access, the kind of place that existed specifically to hold the overflow of people's lives without asking too many questions. At 7:15 in the morning, it was technically open. The office had a light on, but the lot was empty of vehicles and the rows of units sat in the flat morning light, looking like every other storage facility on every other highway in the country. She pulled the truck to the shoulder of Route 9, 200 yards short of the entrance, and sat. "You said they'd have people watching it," she said. Vera said 1 or 2. She knows their resource allocation better than I do. "So we assume one person in that lot." She studied the layout through the windshield. Single entrance, single exit, same gate, keypad on both sides. The unit rows were arranged in a U shape, which meant once you were inside the fence, you had limited sight lines from the entrance. If they're watching Unit 114 specifically, they're positioned somewhere with a direct view of it, which puts them at the end of the center row or on top of the office building. "Office building," Declan said. "Higher ground. Better sight lines across the full lot." "Okay," she thought about it. "If I go in through the main entrance, I'm visible for the full length of the approach. But if they're watching the unit and not the gate—" "They're watching the unit," he said. "They don't know what vehicle we're in. They're not looking for a gray truck with Montana plates at 7 a.m. They're looking for someone who goes directly to 114. She turned that over. "So I don't go directly to 114, she said. He looked at her. "I go to the wrong unit first," she said. "I act like I'm here for something routine. I take long enough at the wrong unit that whoever's watching gets bored or complacent. Then I move. Or they make you immediately, and you've just given them time to call in additional resources. You have a better option." A pause. "No," he said. "I don't." She pulled the truck forward. At the gate keypad, she entered a code. Not the override Declan had given her, but a standard access code she'd read off the facility's website on Vera's laptop before they left. The one that let new customers do a walkthrough during business hours. It worked. The gate rolled back and she drove in at the pace of someone who was not in a hurry. She went to the far row first. Unit 89. She got out of the truck and stood in front of the roll-up door and made a production of checking her phone, which was still without a SIM card, but nobody watching from a distance would know that, and spent 90 seconds looking like a woman who was trying to remember a combination she'd written down somewhere. Then she went back to the truck and drove slowly along the row toward the center section. Unit 114 was in the middle of the second row. She parked the truck 2 units down, facing away from the office building, and got out and walked to 114 without rushing. The keypad was a standard commercial unit. She entered the 6-digit override. The light went green. She rolled the door up and stepped inside and pulled it down behind her. The unit was 10 by 15, climate-controlled, and almost completely empty except for 3 cardboard boxes stacked against the right wall and a gray hard-shell case sitting on a metal shelf at the back. The case had latches on both short ends, exactly as Declan had described. It was the size of a large briefcase, heavier than it looked. She could tell before she even lifted it. And it was locked. She had the override code. She'd assumed it covered the case lock, too. It didn't. She stood in the storage unit with the case in her hands and looked at the lock, a 4-digit mechanical combination, and felt the particular quality of frustration that came from being 90% through a problem and finding out the last 10% was a wall. She went back over everything Declan had told her. He hadn't mentioned a separate case combination. He'd given her the unit override and the description of the case and the contents. Either he'd forgotten to give her the lock code, or he hadn't known it was locked separately. She examined the case more carefully. The latch hardware was the kind used on mil-spec transport cases. Robust, not trivially bypassed. She didn't have tools. She had her hands, the contents of a nurse's supply bag, and a truck with no particular equipment in it. She tried the most obvious 4-digit combinations. Birth years, repeating numbers, sequential numbers. Nothing. She had maybe 6 minutes before whoever was on this lot got suspicious about the truck. She picked up the 3 cardboard boxes. 2 of them were empty, packing filler, nothing inside. The third had weight to it. She opened it and found, sitting loose among wadded newspaper, a folding knife, a handheld radio with a dead battery, and a small spiral notebook with a water-damaged cover. She opened the notebook. The first 20 pages were what looked like operational notes in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Short entries, mostly numbers and abbreviations. The last page with writing on it had 4 digits circled twice in different ink, as if someone had come back to it and confirmed it. She entered the 4 digits into the case lock. It opened. Inside, 3 folders with tabbed labels, each one dense with paper, and a flat black drive and a protective sleeve sitting on top of them. She didn't open the folders. She latched the case, tucked the notebook into the supply bag, and went to the unit door. She listened for 10 seconds. Quiet. She rolled the door up 6 inches, enough to see out at ground level, and scanned the lot. A pair of boots standing still, approximately 30 feet from her unit. Someone was standing directly outside, facing the unit, and they had not been there when she'd walked in. She lowered the door without making a sound and stood in the dimness of the storage unit and thought very fast. 1 person. They were standing still rather than approaching, which meant they were either waiting for backup or they were watching to see if she'd come out on her own. She had the case. She had no weapon. The truck was 20 feet to the left of those boots, and she could not get to it without passing through whoever was standing outside. She checked the unit's walls. Concrete block, no flex, no adjoining access to the neighboring unit. She checked the ceiling, drop tiles, acoustic foam, nothing structural. She checked the floor. Sealed concrete. 1 way in, 1 way out. The boots shifted. She heard them. The scrape of a sole on asphalt, the sound of weight redistributing. Then a voice, not calling out, just speaking at a volume calibrated for someone close enough to hear through a thin roll-up door. "I know you're in there," the voice said, "and I know what's in the case." A pause. "I'm not who you think I am." She said nothing. "My name is Rourke," the voice said. "And before you decide what to do next, you need to hear me out, because the 2 men who came to Vera Solano's house this morning, they weren't sent by the same people who shot Declan Marsh. They were sent by mine." The storage unit was silent. "I've been building this case for 2 years," the voice continued, "and I have been compromised in ways I am still trying to untangle, but I'm not the person who set up Route 9. A beat. I need that case, and I need it in the next 40 minutes, or the officer we're both trying to put in front of a federal panel is going to be on a plane out of the country before noon. Mara stood in the dark of the storage unit with the case in her hands and a man on the other side of the door claiming to be both the person she'd been warned about and the person she needed. She had no way to verify any of it. She had 40 minutes. She had the case. And from the county road beyond the chain-link fence, cutting through the morning quiet, she heard the sound of multiple vehicles moving fast. The vehicles on the county road were moving fast enough that she could hear the engine pit shifting, not slowing for the facility entrance, not turning in, passing. She counted 3 by sound, and then they were gone north, and the silence came back, and she stood in the storage unit and let her heart rate settle 1 notch. Not for them. Not yet. She looked at the roll-up door. The man on the other side was still there. She could see the shadow of his boots in the thin strip of light under the door's lower edge, and he hadn't moved during the vehicle's passage, which told her he wasn't spooked by them, which told her something. She made a decision. She made it in the time it took to exhale once. She rolled the door up. The man standing outside was 53, maybe 55, with the physical erosion of someone who had been under sustained stress for a long time. Not soft, but worn, the way metal wore when it had been under friction. Medium height. Dark jacket. He had his hands visible, which she noted immediately, and he was standing at a distance that was not aggressive, not retreat, just present. He looked at the case in her hands and then at her face, and he didn't move. "Where's your identification?" she said. He reached into his jacket slowly and produced a credentials wallet. He held it out and let her come to him rather than stepping toward her, which was a considered choice. She took it. Federal Investigator, Interagency Oversight Division, a unit she knew existed because she'd been briefed on its jurisdiction during her second deployment, a unit that operated specifically in cases involving military federal boundary crimes. The ID looked right. The photo matched. She handed it back. "You said 40 minutes, she said. "Start talking." He talked fast, which she respected. He didn't preamble. He said, 2 years ago he'd opened an investigation into a senior military officer named Harlan Voss, a general with 3 decades of service and a career built on the specific skill of being in the right position when decisions were made and the wrong position when accountability arrived. Voss had been connected, through financial forensics and a chain of communication intercepts, to the alteration of operational records following a classified mission 3 years prior, the Southern Corridor operation. Voss had ordered an extraction route modification that he knew, based on intelligence his office had received and did not distribute, was going to put the team into a compromised sector. He'd made the decision, and then he'd made the paperwork say something else. "How close are you?" she said. "I was at the door," Rourke said. 2 weeks ago, I had a source inside Voss's current command staff who was ready to provide supporting testimony. That source is now unreachable. I have the intercept analysis and the financial thread, but federal evidentiary standards for military prosecution at this level require corroborating primary source documentation. He looked at the case. "What's in there closes the gap." "And the Route 9 meeting?" "I set it up through a channel I believed was secure. I was wrong." His jaw tightened. "I've spent the last 48 hours trying to determine where the leak was. I believe it was in my own office, a staff member with access to my active case file." He stopped. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you almost got Declan Marsh killed and you're telling me it's not your fault. I'm telling you it's complicated and I don't have time to make it sound better than it is." His voice was flat and direct, and she found she believed that part at least. Voss knows the documentation exists. He's known for 3 years and he's been managing it, eliminating access points, controlling the information environment, making sure that anyone who knew the full picture either stopped knowing it or stopped being able to say it. He looked at her. "Declan Marsh is the last primary witness. You understand what that means?" She understood exactly what it meant. "You said Voss is leaving the country," she said. "He has a private departure scheduled out of a regional airfield near Billings. I found it this morning through a travel authorization that got filed under a cover designation. He's listed as attached to a diplomatic consultation, which gives him documentation that would slow any interdiction at the border." Rourke checked his watch. "The flight window opens in 4 hours. If he's in the air, extradition from where he's going becomes a 2 to 4 year legal process, minimum, and the case effectively dies." Mara looked at the case in her hands. She thought about the 40 minutes he'd cited when she was still inside the unit and how that window had gotten shorter by about 8 of them. "What do you need?" she said. "I need to transmit the drive contents to a federal secure server that is outside my office's infrastructure, one that Voss cannot reach through his command contacts." Rourke produced a phone, a different one from what she'd expect, a hardened unit with a port configuration she recognized from secure field communications equipment. "The transmission takes 11 minutes once we have a connection established. The server is maintained by an oversight body that Voss has no access to. Once it lands there, the case file is sealed under federal evidentiary protection and no single person can alter or suppress it. And then I make 3 calls. 1 to the federal prosecutor who has been on standby for 2 months. 1 to the military oversight board. 1 to the airfield." He looked at her steadily. "And Harlan Voss does not get on that plane." The lot around them was quiet. The morning light was coming up properly now, washing the rows of storage units in flat gray gold, making everything look ordinary and harmless. Somewhere at the far end of the facility, a bird was working at something in the chain-link fence. She thought about Vera, alone in a farmhouse with 2 people coming up the drive. She thought about Declan in the truck on Route 9, bleeding through borrowed clothing, managing pain on technique and stubbornness. She thought about Travers, and a navigational error that had never been an error. She opened the case. The drive interface took 4 minutes to establish. Not because the connection was difficult, but because Rourke had to route it through 2 relay nodes that kept the transmission off any network Voss's people monitored, and the second relay took time to authenticate. Mara stood beside him and watched the progress indicators on the hardened phone screen and kept one eye on the lot entrance and one ear on Route 9, and did not speak because there was nothing useful to say. And silence was easier to manage than conversation when everything was moving at this speed. At the 7-minute mark, a car turned into the facility. Dark sedan, single occupant. It came through the gate on a regular access code, moved along the first row at normal speed, and parked near the office. The driver got out, a woman, middle-aged, pulling a rolling cart toward a unit in the far row. Entirely routine. Mara watched her until she'd rolled the unit door up and disappeared inside, then looked back at the phone. 9 minutes. "When this transmits," she said quietly, "what happens to the people who came after Declan?" "That depends on what the documentation shows specifically. The chain of authorization for the Route 9 intercept. If Voss ordered it directly, that's attempted murder of a federal witness, which adds to the military criminal charges." Rourke didn't look up from the phone. "If it was delegated down through his command network, we work the chain. He'll have insulation. He always has insulation. That's how he's lasted 30 years. Rourke's voice had a specific quality of tired anger in it, the kind that came from spending 2 years chasing something through layers of deliberate obstruction. "The documentation removes the insulation. That's the point of it. Once the altered orders are compared against the authentic ones, there's no version of events where Voss isn't at the center of it." 11 minutes. The progress bar completed. The phone showed a confirmation screen, secure receipt, case file sealed, timestamp. Rourke looked at it for a moment that was a half-second longer than the functional moment. She understood that half-second. It was what 2 years looked like when it finally resolved into a single line of confirmed text on a screen. He made the first call. She stepped away to give him space for it and pulled out the notebook she'd taken from the storage unit and looked at the last page again, the 4 digits circled twice. She thought about Declan sitting in a unit in Montana for 3 years, moving between cities, between countries, holding evidence that could end a career and clear a record and give names to people who had been classified as navigational errors. She thought about the specific kind of endurance that required and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite admiration, because admiration had a distance to it that this didn't. Rourke made the second call, then the third. He came back to her and said, "The airfield has been notified. Federal hold on the departure. Military police are being dispatched from the Billings installation to take Voss into custody pending the formal warrant." "Pending," she said. "How long is pending?" "The prosecutor is issuing the warrant now. He's had the application drafted for 6 weeks, waiting on the evidentiary piece we just gave him." He put the phone away. 2 hours, maybe 3. Voss will be in custody before noon. She thought about that. She thought about what 2 hours meant for Declan and for Vera and for the situation at the farmhouse that she still didn't have any information about. I need to get back to Declan, she said. I'll go with you, Rourke said. You'll stay visible, she said. You'll stay reachable. You'll make sure that whatever happens in the next 2 hours doesn't give anyone a reason to slow the warrant. He looked at her for a moment. You don't trust me, he said. I trust what just transmitted to that server, she said. I'm still working on the rest. She took the case and she left him standing in the lot. What? Declan was where she'd left him. He'd reclined the truck seat and his eyes were closed when she pulled up, but they opened before she'd finished stopping. That same immediate alertness that didn't turn off. She got in and put the case on the back seat and looked at him. He was worse. Not critically. Not in the way that required a decision about turning around. But the progression was visible. Skin tone, the careful stillness, the way his breathing had shallowed. Rourke made the transmission, she said. Documentation is in federal custody. Warrant is being issued. He absorbed this. Something moved through his face. Not relief. Not exactly. More like a man who had been holding a weight in a specific position for 3 years and had just been told he could lower it and wasn't quite sure his muscles would respond correctly. Voss, he said. Federal hold on his departure. Military police from Billings. She paused. A few hours. He nodded. He looked at the ceiling of the truck cab. Vera, he said. I don't know. She started the engine. I'm going back. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her he was fine. He sat in the passenger seat and managed his situation in silence, and she drove. And they didn't talk for the first 10 miles because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't going to make the not knowing about Vera worse. Her phone had no SIM. She couldn't call ahead. She drove and watched the road. The farmhouse looked undisturbed from the county road. Same as they'd left it. Porch light still on, no visible damage to the exterior. Vera's own vehicle still beside the house. Mara pulled the truck to the edge of the property and sat for a full minute reading the scene before she turned onto the drive. She went in slowly. The front door was ajar. She stopped the truck 20 feet from the porch, left the engine running, and looked at that open door for 3 seconds. Then she got out. Stay in the truck, she said. Mara, stay in the truck, Declan. She went to the porch. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and stayed to the side of the frame. Vera was in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with a cold cup of coffee in front of her and a cut on her left cheekbone that had stopped bleeding and was going to leave a mark. And she was looking at something on her laptop with the focused expression of someone who had already processed whatever had happened in the last 2 hours and moved on to the next problem. She looked up at Mara. You're late, Vera said. Mara walked into the kitchen. She looked at the cut. She looked at the broken window latch on the far wall that she hadn't noticed from outside. She looked at the kitchen chair that was against the wrong wall. What happened? She said. The 2 individuals from the SUV came to the door. We had a conversation. Vera touched the cut on her cheek almost absently. It got a little physical before it got conclusive. They left. She paused. One of them is going to need to see a doctor about his wrist. Mara sat down. The documentation is transmitted, she said. Federal custody. Rourke made the calls. Voss is being held at the airfield. Vera was quiet for a moment. Harlan Voss, she said. You knew it was him. I suspected for about a year. Vera's voice was measured. I didn't have enough to say it out loud. Saying it out loud without enough behind it is how you become the next person on his list. She looked at the laptop. He's going to fight it. He can fight it with attorneys, Mara said. The documentation is sealed. Rourke says the chain of authorization is in there. The original orders versus what was filed. Names, dates, the decision to alter the extraction route. Which puts the Southern Corridor casualties on his direct authorization. Yes. Vera said nothing for a moment. She had been in the same operational world as the people who hadn't come back from that mission. She understood what it meant to have it on record. She understood the specific weight of the difference between died by navigational error and died because someone made a deliberate decision and lied about it. She looked at her laptop. There's something you need to see, she said. Mara came around the table. The laptop showed a news alert, a regional Montana news outlet, the kind with a 3-person staff and a website that loaded slowly. The headline read, Federal officials respond to military inquiry at Billings Regional Airfield. The article was 3 paragraphs of thin reporting that knew something was happening and didn't know what, but the photos below it included one that had been taken at a distance through a chain-link fence, blurred with zoom, showing a man in a dark overcoat surrounded by uniforms. Even at that distance and resolution, the bearing was unmistakable. The way the man stood, centered, controlled, the posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any space. She had never met Harlan Voss. She had never seen his face, but she had felt the downstream effects of his decisions in a way that had reorganized the last 3 years of her life. And looking at that blurred photo on a small-town news website on a laptop in a farmhouse kitchen felt like the ground finally becoming solid under her feet after a very long time of not being sure it would hold. "They got him," she said. "They got him at the gate," Vera said. "He hadn't boarded yet." Mara straightened up. She went back outside to the truck, and she opened the passenger door, and she told Declan. She told him simply what the photo showed, what the caption said, what it meant. She watched his face while she said it. He looked out through the windshield at the Montana morning, at the trees and the sky and the pale light coming in low across the property. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "The people who were listed wrong." "They'll be reviewed," Mara said. "That's what Rourke said. Once the authentic orders are compared to what was filed, the records get corrected. Their families. We'll know what actually happened," she said. "Yes." He put his head back against the headrest. His eyes were wet, which he didn't try to hide and didn't try to explain, and she looked away and gave him the moment because some things didn't need to be witnessed. Then she said, "Now we need to get you to a hospital." "I know. Not Calvert Regional." "I know that too." She went back inside and talked to Vera, and Vera made a call, and 40 minutes later they were in a vehicle heading south toward a facility in Great Falls that Vera had a connection to. Not a large hospital, a surgical center, the kind of place that had the capacity for what Declan needed, and the discretion to handle it without an immediate notification chain that would pull in people they weren't ready to deal with yet. The next 6 hours were medical. Not dramatic in the way the previous 18 had been. No tunnels, no dark vehicles, no choices made in split seconds. Just the particular grind of a man being properly treated for wounds that had been inadequately managed for too long. Mara sat in a waiting area with a cup of coffee that was better than the hospital's, and went through the operational sequence in her head, looking for the places where she'd made wrong decisions, or lucky ones, or both, cataloging what she knew and what she still didn't. She thought about Rourke and the compromised channel and the staff member with access to his case file. She thought about whether the case file leak connected back to Voss directly, or through one of the layers he'd maintained around himself. She thought about how a man could spend 30 years making decisions that cost other people everything and maintain the appearance of a decorated service record while doing it. And she arrived at no useful conclusions about that because some things resisted useful conclusions. At the 3-hour mark, Vera came and sat across from her. "The warrant is confirmed," Vera said. "Military and federal joint custody as of 2 hours ago. The prosecutor has begun the formal charge filing." "What's he charged with?" "Falsification of operational records, negligent command resulting in service member casualties, obstruction of a federal investigation." Vera paused. "And 2 counts relating to the attempt on Declan's life on Route 9, once they establish the authorization chain for that." "They'll establish it," Mara said. "It's on the drive." "Rourke seems to think so." Vera looked at her coffee. "He called me. He wanted to pass along that the staff member who leaked his case file has been suspended pending investigation. He wanted you to know that." Mara thought about whether knowing it changed anything for her. Decided it moved a few things, a few degrees in the direction of settled. "My hospital," she said. "Calvert Regional. I'm suspended. I removed a patient from the tracking system. I took him out of the building through a maintenance tunnel. I took hospital supplies." She listed it the way she'd list a medication interaction. Factual, without performance. "Dr. Rice is going to have a complete case for termination." Vera looked at her. "Probably," Vera said. "I'm not looking for reassurance." "I know. I'm just agreeing with your assessment." Vera's voice was dry. "There will be a process. It's not going to be simple." She paused. "What the process looks like may depend on how public the Voss case becomes, and whether the connection to Calvert Regional, and what you did there, becomes part of the record." "I don't want credit for it," Mara said. "That's not the—" "I know what it's not," Vera said. "I'm talking about what the record shows, not what you want." Sometimes those are different things, and you don't get to choose which one matters. Mara looked at her. She thought about the night intake, the tattoo she'd recognized, the 90 seconds she'd asked Dr. Rice for, and the look on his face when she'd asked for them. She thought about removing the bed assignment from the public board, and the moment she'd made that decision, and the clarity with which she'd understood what it would cost her. She'd made the decision anyway, not because she was certain it was right, because she was certain the alternative was worse. "How's he doing?" Vera said. "Surgeon said the splenic bruising is significant, but no rupture. The shoulder is going to need reconstruction work. The thigh is the simplest of the three." Mara looked at the surgical wing doors. "He's going to be in here for a while." "He's been in worse situations for longer," Vera said. "That's not a comfort." "I know." Vera stood up. "There's going to be a federal debrief. Rourke's office is going to want statements from both of you, and from me." She picked up her coat. "They're going to want to know everything, in order, with specifics. You'll need to be prepared for that." "I'm not worried about a debrief," Mara said. "No, you've done enough of them." Vera looked at her for a moment. "You did a good thing. I know you're not looking for someone to say that. But the record should include it somewhere, even if that record is just me saying it to you in a surgical center waiting room." Mara didn't respond to that immediately. After a moment, she said, "Travers?" Vera waited. "She deserves to be on the record. The real record." Mara kept her voice even. "Not the navigational error version." "She will be," Vera said. "The corrected operational record covers everyone from that mission, every person who was misattributed." She paused. "It's not retroactive in the ways that matter most, but it's something." Mara looked at the floor. "It's something," she said. At the 5-hour mark, the surgeon came out and told her that Declan was stable and would be in recovery for another 2 hours. He was the kind of surgeon who gave information in precise quantities and didn't add texture to it, which she appreciated. She thanked him, and he went back through the doors, and she sat back down. At the 6-hour mark, a federal vehicle pulled into the surgical center's parking lot. She saw it from the window beside her chair. A dark SUV, different plates from the one at Vera's house. 2 occupants who got out and straightened their jackets in the particular way of federal agents who were about to enter a space and wanted to be read correctly. They came through the main entrance and spoke to the front desk, and the front desk pointed in her direction. The senior agent was a woman named Carver, 40-something, with a direct manner and the organizational efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the procedural parts were transparent. She identified herself and her partner. She explained that Rourke's office had coordinated this visit, and she said that they were here to take formal statements as part of the active federal case. "Before we start," Mara said, "I need you to tell me something." Carver waited. "Harlan Voss. Is he contained?" "The general is in federal custody at the Billings installation," Carver said. "Joint military federal hold. His legal representation arrived 2 hours ago. He's talking to lawyers." "That is his right," Carver said, in the tone of someone who was aware of the operational frustration of that fact and was not going to express it officially. Mara nodded. She started at the beginning. She told it in the order it happened, with the specific detail that she'd learned to include in operational reporting, times where she had them, locations, what she saw versus what she inferred, what decisions she made, and the reasoning behind each one. She did not editorialize. She did not minimize. She did not perform. Carver's partner took notes and asked occasional clarifying questions that told her he was listening carefully rather than just transcribing. Carver herself mostly listened, which in Mara's experience meant she was the one who would be doing the analysis later. It took 2 hours. At the end, Carver looked at her notes and then at Mara and said, "The incident at Calvert Regional, the patient location modification." "Yes," Mara said. "You understand that the hospital administration filed a report with the county this morning." "I assumed they would." "The report describes a suspended employee removing a critical patient from the facility." Carver's voice was neutral. "The hospital's position is that it constitutes patient endangerment and theft of medical supplies." Mara looked at her. "His blood type was a negative," she said. "He had a potential splenic rupture and 2 additional wound sites that had been partially treated. The men in that lobby were going to reach his room in approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and they were not there to continue his medical care." She paused. "I assessed the risk, and I made a decision." Carver looked at her for a long moment. "We'll need to provide the hospital with context from this case," Carver said. which is not the same as telling you it resolves cleanly. I know it doesn't resolve cleanly, Mara said. I never thought it would. Carver closed her notebook. One more thing, she said. She reached into the bag beside her chair and produced a sealed folder, which she placed on the table between them. Rourke asked me to deliver this to you directly. He said you'd understand what it was. Mara looked at the folder. It was standard federal document sleeve, sealed at the top, with a case reference number she didn't recognize and a classification marker she did. She opened it. Inside was a single document, a corrected operational record from the Southern Corridor mission. It had been generated that morning, time-stamped 2 hours ago, and it contained the names of every person who had been on that operation and the correctly attributed account of what had happened and why. Travers was on page 3, not as a navigational error, as what she actually was, a medic who had been placed in a compromised sector by a deliberate command decision, who had performed her duties under fire until the end, and who had died as a direct consequence of an order that had been falsified in the record that followed. Mara read the paragraph twice. She closed the folder. She sat quietly for a moment in the waiting room of a surgical center in Great Falls, Montana, with the sound of a parking lot and a distant highway outside and the soft mechanical noise of the building around her. Carver was watching her, not intrusively, just present. "Thank you," Mara said. Her voice came out level. She was surprised by that, and then she wasn't. "Rourke wanted you to have it today," Carver said. "He thought you should see it before the press gets hold of the broader case file, which is going to happen." She paused. "This particular part of it is going to get attention." "How much attention?" Mara said. Carver considered how to say it. "Harlan Voss has been decorated at every level," she said. "His career is public record. What he did, the specific decision, the falsification, the 3 years of witness suppression, the contrast with that public record is going to be significant." Mara thought about significant. She thought about what it meant for something to be significant in the public record versus what it meant for the people it had actually happened to. "The families," she said, "of the people from that mission. Rourke's office is coordinating notifications through official channels." Carver's voice went slightly quieter. "Today, before the press cycle." Mara nodded. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked at the parking lot and the federal SUV and the ordinary Montana morning going about its business outside. And she thought about a highway on Route 9 and a man who had carried evidence for 3 years and nearly bled out in a gravel shoulder trying to get it to the right place. And she thought about Vera with a cut on her cheek sitting at a kitchen table. And she thought about the 2 men who'd come to the hospital lobby without credentials. She thought about Dr. Rice and the look on his face when she'd said, "Give me 90 seconds." She thought about everything that had happened in less than 24 hours and how none of it had gone the way any plan would have designed it to go. It had been improvised and physical and exhausting, and several times it had been extremely close to going very wrong. She had made decisions that could still cost her the job she'd built in this quiet Montana life. She had used her hands and her knowledge and 4 years of military experience that she'd been trying to set down, and the experience had turned out to be something she couldn't actually set down because it was part of the structure of her. She turned back from the window. Carver was on her phone, handling something else. The case continuing to move in the ways that federal cases moved, the machinery of it turning. Her partner was reviewing his notes. Mara sat back down. She picked up her coffee. And then Carver ended her call and looked up, and her expression had changed in a specific way. The way expressions changed when information arrived that was more significant than expected. "What?" Mara said. Carver set the phone down on the table. "Rourke's office just received a communication," she said carefully, "from an attorney representing General Voss." "He's already filing," Mara said. "That's not surprising." "It's not the filing," Carver paused. "The communication includes a claim that there is a second documentation cache, separate from what was in the storage unit." She looked at Mara steadily. "The attorney is claiming that Voss has his own documentation, records that contradict the authentication of what was transmitted this morning, that the orders in the drive were altered before Declan Marsh acquired them." Mara was very still. "He's saying the drive is fabricated," she said. "He's saying the drive is fabricated," Carver confirmed. "And if his legal team can produce documentation that supports that claim, the evidentiary case collapses. The warrant can be challenged. The custody hold has a limited window before his attorneys can petition for release." She held Mara's gaze. "He's been planning this. A counter-documentation strategy. A backup argument prepared for exactly the scenario where the evidence surfaced. The waiting room was quiet. Declan would know, Mara said. He would know if there was a countercache. If Voss built a version of the record designed to discredit the authentic one. We need to talk to Marsh, Carver said. Now, before his attorneys file the formal challenge, which our office is being told will happen in approximately 90 minutes. Mara stood. She was already moving toward the surgical wing doors when Carver said, "He's still in recovery." "I know," Mara said, and pushed through the doors anyway. The recovery room was dim and smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and Declan was on his back with his eyes closed and a monitor running steady numbers above his head when Mara pushed through the door. A nurse, young, startled, came up from the chair in the corner with the beginning of an objection forming on her face. "Federal case," Mara said. She didn't slow down. "I need 2 minutes with him." The nurse looked at the agent badge Carver had flashed behind Mara in the doorway and made a rapid calculation about her morning and stepped back. Mara put her hand on Declan's arm. His eyes opened. Not startled, immediate. She was beginning to think he didn't have a startled mode. "Voss's attorneys," she said quietly and fast. "They're filing a challenge in 90 minutes. They're claiming the documentation on the drive was altered before you acquired it. That there's a countercache, Voss's own records, designed to authenticate a different version of the orders." He looked at the ceiling. "How long have they had it prepared?" she said. "Long enough." His voice was rough from the anesthesia, but his thinking was clearly intact. "I knew he'd have a contingency. Someone who spent 3 years managing this doesn't go down without a fallback argument." He paused, breathed through something. "The countercache won't hold." "Why not?" "Because the authentication on the drive isn't mine." He turned his head to look at her. "I didn't acquire the documentation, Mara. I was asked to transport and protect it. The person who compiled it, who pulled the original orders from the actual command archive before Voss could sanitize it, that was someone inside his own structure. Someone who was there at the beginning and kept copies before the falsification happened." She waited. "His name is Garrison," Declan said. "Colonel Walter Garrison, Voss's former chief of staff. He was present when the route modification order was issued, and he kept the original alongside everything that came after it, because even then he knew what he was looking at." He stopped. "Garrison built in authentication markers that are embedded in the document metadata. Chain of custody timestamps, cryptographic signatures, things that can be independently verified against the command archive servers that Voss never had complete access to because they're maintained by a separate oversight body. If the metadata can be verified independently, then Voss's counter documents have nothing to authenticate against except his own claim," Declan said. "His attorneys can produce whatever version of the orders he had fabricated, but the metadata on the real documents traces back to a server that Voss cannot have modified, because he doesn't have the clearance tier, and the access logs would show any attempt." He looked at her. "Garrison knew that. That's why he built it that way." "Where is Garrison?" "The last I knew, he'd retired to somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Rourke's office should be able to locate him. He's not hiding. He's been waiting." Declan's voice was very tired, but very certain. He knew this day was going to come. He just didn't know when. Mara straightened up. "Stay here," she said. "I'm in a recovery room," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She went back through the door. "What?" Carver was already on the phone when Mara reached her, but she ended the call when she saw Mara's face. Mara told her about Garrison in under 2 minutes. She gave her what she had: name, rank, relationship to Voss, the authentication structure embedded in the documentation, the independent server that Voss couldn't have touched. She gave it all in the flat, efficient sequence that she used for medical reporting, and Carver listened without interrupting and then picked up her phone again before Mara had finished her last sentence. The call she made was short. Then she made a second one. Then she put the phone away. "Rourke is pulling Garrison's current address through the retired officer registry," she said. "His forensic analyst is already running the metadata verification against the oversight server logs. That process takes about 40 minutes. If the authentication holds..." "It'll hold," Mara said. Carver looked at her. "You're certain?" "Declan Marsh has been carrying that case for 3 years," Mara said. "He's been shot, he's moved between countries, he's lost every other person who knew what he knew. If the authentication hadn't been solid, he would have found a different way to make this work. He wouldn't have carried something fragile for 3 years. Carver considered this. 40 minutes, she said. Then we'll know. 40 minutes was not nothing. 40 minutes was enough time for Voss's legal team to file the formal challenge, enough time for a duty judge to begin reviewing the custody petition, enough time for the momentum of a case to start fracturing at the edges. Mara knew this. She sat in the waiting room and she understood that the next 40 minutes were going to be exactly as long as they were, and there was nothing she could do to make them shorter. She drank the rest of her cold coffee. She thought about Garrison, a chief of staff who had stood in a command room 30 years into his career and watched his commanding officer issue an order that he knew was wrong, and who had done the specific, unglamorous, undramatic thing of making copies before the falsification could happen, and then spending 3 years waiting for the mechanism to exist that would allow those copies to matter. There was no version of that story that was clean or comfortable. He had spent 3 years knowing what he knew and not being able to act on it without a chain of corroboration that didn't yet exist. That was its own kind of weight, different from Declan's, but not lighter. She thought about all the people who had done the right thing in ways that nobody saw. At the 37-minute mark, Carver's phone rang. She answered, listened, said 3 words, and ended the call. She looked at Mara. Metadata verified, she said. 17 independent authentication points confirmed against the command oversight server. Chain of custody is intact from point of original document creation. The timestamps predate the falsification by 11 days, which means the originals were pulled before Voss's people altered the record. She paused. The counter documents his attorneys filed show metadata consistent with creation within the last 18 months. The forensic discrepancy is not arguable. Mara sat very still. His challenge fails, she said. His challenge fails, Carver confirmed. The warrant stands. The custody hold becomes permanent pending formal charges. His attorneys can appeal, and they will, but the evidentiary foundation is solid enough that the appeals process is years, not months, and he will not be released during it given the flight risk determination. Mara looked at the window. Outside, Montana was going about its business in the particular unhurried way of a place that had seen enough weather and enough hard seasons to take the long view on most things. A truck pulled into the lot. Someone walked across the parking lot with coffee. Ordinary. Colonel Garrison, she said. Rourke's office is contacting him this morning. Carver's voice was careful. He'll be asked to provide formal testimony. Given that the authentication is verified, his statement will be corroborating rather than foundational, but it matters. It will matter to the record. It will matter to him, Mara said, being able to say it out loud. Carver looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who is used to cases and not always used to the people inside them. Yes, she said. I imagine it will. The formal charges against General Harlan Voss were filed at 2:17 in the afternoon. Mara heard about it through Carver, who received the notification while sitting across from her in the surgical center cafeteria over food that neither of them ate very much of. The charges were falsification of military operational records, dereliction of command duty resulting in service member casualties, obstruction of a federal investigation, conspiracy to suppress evidence, and authorization of criminal acts against a protected witness. The last charge carried the weight of everything Voss had tried to do to Declan on Route 9 and in the hospital, run backward through the authorization chain that the documentation established. It was not a short list. When Carver read it to her, Mara didn't feel the things she'd expected to feel. The clean relief of a completed task, the satisfaction of a closed loop. What she actually felt was more complicated and less cinematic than that. Something like the end of a held breath, and underneath it the specific ache of things that were resolved in the record but not in the world, because Travers wasn't coming back, and the other people from the Southern Corridor mission weren't coming back, and a corrected operational file and a set of federal charges, as real and necessary as they were, did not fill the spaces those people had occupied. She knew this. She'd known it would be this way. That didn't make it easier to sit with. She sat with it anyway. The press release from Rourke's office goes out at 4 o'clock. Carver said. Regional outlets will pick it up by evening, national by morning. How much detail? Enough that the public record is clear about what happened and who made the decisions. Carver paused. Your name is in the operational summary, as a material witness and as the individual who secured and transferred the documentation. She watched Mara's face. It's going to be part of the public record. I know. People will contact you. I know that too. Mara looked at her coffee cup. I'm not sure what I'm going to say to people. You don't have to figure that out today, Carver said. Today you get to just be the person it happened to. Mara looked at her. She thought she had misjudged Carver somewhat in the first hour of knowing her. Carver was precise and procedural, yes, but underneath the professional efficiency was someone who had spent enough time in rooms where things had gone wrong to understand what it cost people. Thank you, Mara said. Carver shook her head slightly. Don't thank me. The case did what it was supposed to do. She was allowed into Declan's room at 5 in the afternoon. He'd been moved to a proper room by then, a private one. Carver's office had arranged it, which was the kind of thing federal case involvement did for your hospital accommodations, whether you wanted the attention or not. He was propped up at a slight angle, and the color in his face was better, not good but better. The improvement that came from a surgical team having addressed the actual mechanical problems rather than the field management that had been keeping him upright since Route 9. He looked at her when she came in. Charges filed, she said. I know, the nurse told me. He paused. She seemed to think I'd want to know immediately. I think she was right. Mara pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat in it, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was comfortable in the specific way of silence between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. Garrison, he said. Rourke's office reached him. He's been contacted. He's providing testimony. She paused. Declan, did you know about the authentication markers when you were carrying it? He thought about that. I knew the documentation was solid, he said. Garrison told me it was built to survive a challenge. I didn't know the specific technical structure. He looked at the window. I had to trust that he'd done it correctly. For 3 years, that's what I was carrying. Not just the case, but the trust that what was in it was built to last. He stopped. That's a different kind of weight. I know, she said. Your unit, he said. Travers. She looked at her hands. She's on the corrected record, she said. Properly attributed. What happened, and why, and who made the decision? She paused. Rourke's office is doing notifications today. Her family will know before the press release. He nodded slowly. That matters, he said. It matters, she agreed. They sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, What happens to you now, Calvert Regional? I don't know yet. She said it without evasion. There's a formal complaint filed with the county. The hospital's position is what it is. There's going to be a process, licensing review, possibly more. I knew that when I moved his room assignment in the system. You knew it then? Yes. And you did it anyway? I did it anyway. She looked at him. Because the alternative was worse. That's all. It wasn't a noble calculation. It was just the only decision that made sense when I was standing there. Declan was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, I'll say everything that needs to be said to whoever needs to hear it about what you did and why and what it prevented. I know you will, she said. I'm not worried about having someone in my corner. I've just learned not to assume that having someone in your corner means the process is going to be simple. He almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to it on his face, and it changed him, made him look like someone who had existed before 3 years of running, someone who had history before all of this. Fair, he said. The press release went out at 4 o'clock. By 6, the regional Montana outlets had it. By 8, the national wire services had picked up the core facts. A decorated general in federal custody, military charges, a 3-year investigation, falsified operational records from a classified mission that had resulted in service member casualties. By 10 o'clock, Carver's phone had not stopped, and Rourke's name was being mentioned on cable news in the context of a significant military misconduct case, and Vera had sent Mara a text on a replacement phone that Carver had arranged. It's loud out there. You doing okay? Mara sent back, yes. You? Vera sent, the cut on my cheek is going to scar. I'm going to tell people I got it doing something interesting. Mara looked at that for a moment and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since 5 in the morning on a gravel shoulder looking at dark SUV boots through the gap under a storage unit door. She put the phone down. She sat in the surgical center waiting room, which had become, at this point, something close to her address for the day, and she watched the news cycle do what the news cycle did. Absorb a story, compress it into a version that fit a broadcast segment, generate heat around the parts that were most dramatic and less heat around the parts that were most important, which in this case meant a great deal of coverage of Voss's career and decorations and the spectacular contrast of the charges, and considerably less coverage of the specific people who had been misattributed and what their families were learning today. She understood this. She didn't like it. Both things were true. At 9 in the evening, Rourke himself called her on the replacement phone. He sounded tired in the way of someone who had been running on adrenaline and case file anxiety for 2 years and was now experiencing the specific exhaustion of a thing being over. He thanked her in a way that was genuine and slightly awkward, because genuine gratitude was harder to deliver than professional language, and she appreciated the awkwardness for what it was. He told her that the staff member who had leaked his case file had been formally suspended and referred for criminal investigation. He told her that the Command Archive server logs had confirmed no access attempts from Voss's clearance tier, which closed the authentication question permanently. He told her that Garrison had provided a recorded statement by phone that afternoon and was prepared to appear in person for the formal proceedings. Then he said, "The Oversight Board received a communication this afternoon from a federal advisory panel. They're recommending a formal commendation for the actions that secured the documentation and enabled the case to proceed." He paused. "Your name is on the recommendation." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm still suspended from my job," she said. "I know." His voice was careful. "My office has been in contact with the hospital administration. We've provided the full operational context for what happened on the night in question. The formal position of my office is that your actions were consistent with the protection of a federal witness under imminent threat." He paused. "What the hospital does with that context is their determination. I can't make it for them." "I'm not asking you to." "I know." Another pause. "I think you should know. It was the right thing to do. All of it. The decision in the tracking system, the service tunnel, getting him out. If you hadn't done what you did that night, Declan Marsh doesn't survive to make the handoff possible, and the case doesn't close, and Voss is on a plane to somewhere we can't easily reach him." He stopped. "I know the institutional consequences are still real. I'm not pretending they aren't, but the thing you did mattered." "I know it mattered," she said. "I knew it when I did it." "Yeah," he said. "I figured." After she ended the call, she sat with the phone in her hands and thought about that. About knowing something matters while you're doing it, while the cost of it is still theoretical, and then while the cost of it becomes real. About the way some decisions didn't feel like decisions in the moment because there was simply the thing that needed doing and you either did it or you didn't. She had done it. The consequences were the consequences. She could live with that. 3 weeks later, the Licensing Review Board at the Montana Department of Labor and Industry met to consider the complaint filed by Calvert Regional Trauma Center. Mara sat across from a 5-person panel in a conference room in Helena and answered every question they asked. She was direct, she was specific. She did not perform remorse she didn't feel, and she did not minimize the actions she'd taken or the protocols she'd broken. She explained the clinical reasoning, the threat assessment, the specific decision points, and the outcomes. She explained why she'd done what she'd done, and that if she were placed in the same circumstances, she would not arrive at a different answer. The federal case documentation had been submitted as context prior to the hearing. Rourke's office had provided a formal letter. Carver had submitted a statement. Declan had submitted a written account of the events of that night from the patient's perspective, which he had written himself and which was, Mara had been told, precise and detailed, and exactly as useful as his 3 years of operational experience would suggest. The panel deliberated for 4 hours. Their finding, the actions taken by Mara Hendricks on the night in question, while technically in violation of specific hospital protocols, were taken under extraordinary circumstances, consistent with the immediate protection of human life, and were materially connected to the successful resolution of a federal case involving crimes of significant severity. Her nursing license was maintained. A formal notation of the event was added to her professional record, as was required by the process, alongside the context that explained it. She was not fired. She was, in the formal language of the letter she received, cleared to practice. What she did with that clearance was her own business. She didn't go back to Calvert Regional, not because she was forced out. The hospital's administration, following the federal context letter, had walked back the termination filing and offered her a return. She considered it for approximately 4 days and then declined politely, without drama. Dr. Rice called her once. The conversation was brief and honest in a way that she respected. He told her he understood why she'd done what she'd done now that he had the complete picture, and he told her that his initial assessment of the situation had been wrong. He did not say it easily. She gave him credit for saying it at all. "I didn't know what I was looking at," he said. "You knew what the protocol said," she told him. "You weren't wrong about that part." "I was wrong about you." "Yeah," she said. "A little bit." She thought about whether she wanted to continue the conversation into something warmer. She decided the honesty was enough. She thanked him for calling. What she did instead of returning to Calvert Regional was something she hadn't planned and didn't fully anticipate. Rourke's office had been in contact with a federal interagency working group that operated specifically at the intersection of military and civilian medical care, a unit focused on the treatment of personnel whose operational identities made standard care pathways problematic. The unit needed people who could navigate both the clinical and the operational dimensions of that problem. People who had been in both rooms. The conversation with Rourke about it took 40 minutes. The conversation with the working group director took 2 hours. Neither conversation felt like a job interview in the conventional sense. They felt like people trying to solve a problem and seeing if she was interested in being part of the solution. She was interested. The work was going to be complicated. It was going to put her back in proximity to operational realities. She'd been trying to set down for 8 months, and she was honest with herself about the fact that she wasn't entirely sure she had finished processing the last time she'd been in those realities. She was imperfect at most things that mattered. She knew this about herself. She had been catastrophically underestimated, and she had been right about things other people dismissed, and she had also made decisions under pressure that were the best available option rather than the right one in any clean sense. And she carried all of that into the new position without pretending any of it was simpler than it was. That was the work. Not the version where you were certain and the decisions were clear and everything you did was justified in the moment and confirmed afterward. The version where you operated on incomplete information under time pressure and lived with the results and tried to do better with what you learned. That was the only version that existed. Declan was discharged from the Great Falls Surgical Center after 11 days. Vera drove him. Mara met them at a diner on Route 9, not near the spot where he'd been found, but the same highway, which felt like something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The diner was the kind of place that had been on that road for 30 years and would be there for 30 more, with coffee that was strong and pie that was better than it had any reason to be, and a staff that had the specific quality of people who had seen enough travelers to not be particularly interested in why you were there. They sat in a booth and drank coffee and ate the pie and talked about things that were not the case and not Voss and not the investigation. They talked about the terrain north of Shelby Creek and about Vera's property and about what Declan was going to do with the next portion of his life now that the portion he'd spent running had concluded. He didn't have a complete answer. She didn't expect one. "My service record is being restored," he said. "Officially. The corrected attribution, the classification review, my designation comes back on the record as it actually was." He looked at his coffee. "I don't know what to do with that exactly. Having it and not having it were both just circumstances. The thing that was true either way." "The record matters," Vera said, "for the people who come after and read it." "I know," he said. "I'm not minimizing it. I'm just saying I spent 3 years being officially dead, and I'm not entirely sure officially alive is going to feel that different on a Tuesday." Mara looked at him. "It'll feel different," she said. "Not every Tuesday, but some of them." He considered this. "Probably," he said. Vera refilled her coffee from the carafe the server had left on the table and said, "Garrison testified in person last week. I read the transcript." "I know," Declan said. "Rourke sent it to me." "The part where he describes the moment the order was issued," Vera said. "The room, who was in it, what Voss said, and how he said it. Garrison said he knew in that moment that he was watching something he was going to have to account for eventually." She paused. "He'd been carrying that for 3 years too. Different weight, different shape, but the same duration." Mara thought about duration, about how long people carried things before the mechanism existed to put them down, about the gap between knowing something was wrong and having the capacity to make it right. and how that gap could span years and require the convergence of circumstances that no individual person controlled. Garrison had made copies before the falsification. Declan had transported them through 3 years and 3 countries. Mara had recognized a classified tattoo in a trauma bay in the middle of the night and made a decision to act on what she recognized. None of them had done it alone. None of them had done it cleanly. All of them had paid something. That was the actual shape of it. Not the version where one person with exceptional insight single-handedly corrected an injustice in a sequence of clear decisions. The version where multiple people, imperfectly, over time, in proximity to each other, did the things available to them to do. The version that required all of them to work. The version that was actually how things got fixed, when they got fixed at all. The formal proceedings against Harlan Voss ran for 7 months. Mara followed them the way you followed something that had been part of your life without being your life, aware, not consumed. She read the updates when they came, and she thought about them, and she set them down, and she went back to the work she was building in the new position. She was good at the work. She had been good at it from the beginning because the skill set it required was one she'd spent years developing without knowing she was developing it for this exact application. She was still imperfect at many things. She was still the person who covered shifts she didn't have to cover and overrode protocols when she believed the protocol was costing someone something they couldn't afford. She was still the person who made decisions under pressure and lived with the outcomes. She stopped trying to change those things about herself. She started trying to be more deliberate about which situations she walked into and whether she was the right person for them. That was a different project. Voss was convicted on 6 of the 8 charges. The remaining 2 charges were still in the appellate process when the initial verdict came down, which meant his legal team would continue working for the next year or two, which was how these things went and which she had learned to accept as the difference between the mechanism working and the mechanism working cleanly. The mechanism rarely worked cleanly. It worked or it didn't, and in this case it had. He was sentenced. He was removed from his position. His decorations and rank were stripped in a formal process that, unlike most formal processes, was public and on the record. There was something in that, not satisfaction exactly, because satisfaction implied the wrong kind of completion, but something like the correct assignment of weight to the correct places. Things were where they should be on the ledger. That was not everything. It was not nothing. The families of the people from the Southern Corridor mission received formal notifications, formal apologies, and the corrected records. She didn't know what those conversations were like because she wasn't in them, because they didn't need her in them. She knew they happened. She knew what it was to get information you'd deserved for years and had been denied, and she knew that receiving it didn't close the wound, but it changed the shape of it, and sometimes changing the shape of it was what allowed a person to carry it differently. She hoped it helped. She knew hope was not the same as certainty. She carried that too. 8 months after Route 9, Declan came through the city where Mara's new posting was based. He was passing through. He had taken a consulting position with an oversight nonprofit that worked on military record accuracy, which was the kind of work that suited him, specific, necessary, not visible, and connected to what had happened to him in a way that gave the 3 years of running some purpose beyond their own survival. He was moving differently now. Not fully. The shoulder would have limitations for the rest of his life, and he knew it, but differently. Looser. Less of the sustained readiness in his posture that came from operating in a state of permanent threat. They had dinner. Not at a diner this time, a restaurant in the city, the kind of place that had tablecloths and wine and people having ordinary conversations about ordinary things on all sides of them. It felt slightly strange and also fine. He told her he'd heard the licensing review outcome. "I know," she said. "Vera told you." "Vera tells me things," he said. "She thinks I should know." "She's probably right." He looked at his glass. "I've been trying to figure out how to say what I actually want to say without it coming out wrong," he said. "I'm not good at this." "You don't have to be good at it," she said. "Just say it." He looked at her. "You could have let me be someone else's problem," he said. "In the bay that night. You could have stepped back when Rice told you to and let security handle it, and nobody would have blamed you, and you would still have your job at Calvert Regional, and none of the last 8 months would have happened to you." He stopped. "And I would be dead, and the case would be dead, and Voss would be on a plane somewhere." He paused. "I know that's not why you did it. I know you didn't do it because of the outcome. You did it because of what you saw in front of you and what you knew and what you couldn't make yourself walk away from. She didn't say anything. I'm trying to tell you that it mattered, he said. Not the case, not the charges. You, the decision you made. It mattered. She looked at him across the tablecloth and the wine glasses and the ordinary restaurant noise. I know, she said. I know it mattered. You knew it when you were doing it. I knew it when I was doing it, she agreed. It wasn't easier for knowing. No, he said. It never is. They were quiet for a moment. Then she said, the people who overlooked you for 3 years. The ones who looked at a man on a gurney and saw a threat and not a soldier. The ones who looked at me and saw a nurse who was out of her lane. She paused. I used to think the lesson from that was something about proving yourself, about making sure people knew what you were capable of. And now, he said, now I think the lesson is simpler than that, she said. Some people are going to see only what they expect to see, and you still have to do the work, not to make them see differently, just because the work needs doing, and you're the one who can do it. She looked at the table. The recognition. If it comes, it comes. If it doesn't, the work still happened. It still counted. He was quiet for a moment. That's a harder thing to believe than it sounds, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She looked up at him. I believe it anyway. Anyway, she said. Outside the restaurant window, the city was doing what cities did in the evening, lit up and moving, full of people going toward things and away from things, the ordinary, enormous business of lives proceeding. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked back at the table and the man across from it, who had been officially dead for 3 years and was now officially, correctly, on the record as the thing he had actually always been. She thought about Travers. She thought about everyone who had carried the true version of things in the absence of any official confirmation that the true version existed. She thought about what it meant to be overlooked, not just by other people, but by the systems and structures and records that were supposed to hold truth, to be invisible to the machinery that was supposed to see you, and what it required of a person to keep being exactly what they were in the absence of that recognition, not performing it for anyone, not waiting for anyone to confirm it, just continuing to be the thing you were because you were it. That was the real work. Not the tunnels, not the storage unit, not the documentation and the charges and the press release. All of that was the result of the real work, which was quieter and harder, and happened long before any of it. In the moment you decided not to become something smaller than what you were just because someone expected you to. She had made that decision a long time ago, in different rooms, under different circumstances, with different things at stake. She had kept making it. She intended to keep making it still.